2 days ago, in the narrow waters of the Red Sea, a missile came out of nowhere. It struck the Saudi oil tanker Inslia just below the bow, and fire spread fast across her deck. The crew survived. But 600 miles away, in Washington, the strike was already being read as something far bigger than one burning ship. It was a signal, a test, the opening move in a new and more dangerous phase of a war that had already been building for 5 months, one that was about to threaten the two narrow doorways the entire world depends on to move its oil. To understand what happened next, go back to the beginning. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of airstrikes across Iran. Military sites, government buildings, air defense batteries. In the opening hours, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated. Within days, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed as his successor by Iran's assembly of experts. Iran did not stay silent for long. It answered with missiles and drones aimed at Israel, at American bases across the Gulf, and at the oil infrastructure of neighboring states. The war had a name almost immediately: the 2026 Iran War. Nobody knew yet how long it would last. Israel moved fast to cut the head off Iran's naval command. Alireza Tangsiri, the officer overseeing Iran's efforts to control the Strait of Hormuz, was assassinated in the opening weeks of the campaign. It did not stop the strategy he had built. It only meant someone else had to carry it out. Within 2 weeks, Iran turned to its oldest and most effective weapon, geography. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through it every single day. On the 11th of March, the Pentagon reported that American forces had destroyed 16 Iranian boats caught laying naval mines inside the strait. It did not stop there. Ships were boarded. Ships were struck. By the end of the crisis's early phase, at least 17 merchant vessels had been damaged, 7 of them abandoned at sea, 2 of them seized outright, and 12 seafarers were dead or missing. 1 tugboat sank. A port worker was killed in Bahrain. On 19th of March, the United States began its own campaign to force the strait back open, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drone units directly. There had been a chance to stop it there. Mediators brought both sides to Islamabad for ceasefire talks in early April. The talks failed. On the 13th of April, Washington escalated further, a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. American warships intercepted 85 vessels. 26 more slipped through anyway. By Washington's own accounting, the blockade was costing Iran $500 million a day. Iran responded by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own. For a moment, in early March, President Trump had told reporters the war was very complete. Pretty much. He was wrong. The war did not end. It only changed shape. It changed shape most violently on the 17th of July at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. An Iranian missile and drone attack hit the base directly, tearing through a dining facility. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25 years old, from Ewa Beach, Hawaii, was killed. So was Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19, from Carrollton, Texas. A third soldier, Sergeant Angel Rampersad, 28, of Ozono Park, New York, was reported missing and later presumed dead. 3 days later, in northern Iraq, Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton, 30 years old, a father of 2 from Fayetteville, North Carolina, was killed during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone at Erbil Air Base. On the 22nd of July, President Trump traveled to Dover Air Force Base to receive all 4 of them. It was the 3rd dignified transfer he had attended since the war began. "There is no games, there is no nothing," he told reporters beforehand. "That is their child." Their deaths brought the American total in this war to 18. By then, the United States had struck Iran on 12 consecutive nights, hitting shipyards, radar sites, and drone facilities across a dozen cities. Iran fired back at American positions in Kuwait and Jordan, warning that no infrastructure in the region will be safe if its own security was not guaranteed. And that is the moment a second front opened, one that had nothing directly to do with Iran's own coastline at all. Saudi Arabia had built a workaround, a pipeline running the width of the country from its eastern oil fields to a Red Sea port in the west, letting tankers bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely and sail out through the Bab-el-Mandeb, the strait whose name translates, aptly, to the Gate of Tears. For a while it worked. The Houthis themselves are not new to this war, or to any war. They are a tribal movement from the mountains of northern Yemen who swept south during the Arab Spring in 2014, seized the capital, Sana'a. Saudi Arabia went to war against them in 2015, certain that a modern air force would end the matter in weeks. It did not. The Houthis retreated into coastal mountains laced with caves and tunnels, absorbed years of airstrikes, and never lost the capital. For a time, a fragile truce held between them and Riyadh. Then, in mid-July, an Iranian aircraft slipped into Yemen carrying Revolutionary Guard commanders and advanced missile technology for the Houthi movement, the Iran-aligned group that has controlled Yemen's capital since 2014 and has spent a decade surviving Saudi airstrikes from deep inside its coastal mountains. Within days, the Houthis declared a maritime blockade of their own, this time against Saudi Arabia. 2 tankers were struck. Supertankers began reversing course mid-transit rather than risk the strait. Vessels linked to Chinese owners changed their radio identification to reads Hiashine an owner, hoping the label alone would keep them off a target list. This is the part of the story worth pausing on before it goes further, because stories like this one keep unfolding in real time, and the value of following a channel like this is that you get the next chapter as it happens, not months later when the outcome is already old news. If that is useful to you, subscribing costs nothing, and it means you will not miss where this goes next. Thank you for being here for it. Washington's response was blunt. Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the administration's approach as a head for an eye. President Trump went further, warning that for every ship Iran or its proxies struck, the United States would destroy an Iranian bridge or power plant, including, he said, ones inside Tehran itself. Iran matched the threat, promising to hit bridges and energy facilities across the region wherever American interests could be found. Then, almost in the same breath, Washington signed a civil nuclear energy agreement with Saudi Arabia on the explicit condition that Riyadh normalize relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a historic step. Critics called it something else. A nuclear technology transfer offered in the middle of a live regional war to a kingdom whose neighbors, Egypt, Turkey, would now have their own reasons to want the same thing. Very top. Total casualty and oil price figures continue to change week to week. Figures above reflect reporting as of July 23rd, 26. Oil prices, meanwhile, did what narrow water always makes them do. They climbed. Not because the world ran out of oil, but because shipping companies stopped trusting the 11-mile gap between Yemen's mountains and the open sea, and stopped trusting the 21-mile gap between Iran and Oman. Insurance costs for tankers entering either strait rose sharply. Some owners simply stopped bidding on the routes at all. Convoys began forming instead of solo transits, tankers waiting days at anchor for a naval escort before attempting the crossing together, the way merchant fleets once crossed the Atlantic under threat of submarines. The human cost kept climbing alongside it, on every side of the map. Strikes inside Iran killed civilians as well as soldiers. Field hospitals in the region reported treating burn and blast injuries in growing numbers as the bombing campaign continued night after night. None of the governments involved have offered a final count, and figures from state media on any side should be treated with caution until independently confirmed. Total civilian casualty figures and hospital capacity numbers, which vary by source and week. Here is what is easy to miss in a story told through missile counts and blockade tonnage. None of it started with the water. It started with 2 coastlines, on opposite sides of a peninsula, that happened to be the only 2 doors on a very crowded room. Every ship that has burned, every soldier flown home to Dover in a flag-draped case, every dollar added to a gallon of gasoline in a country thousands of miles from either strait, all of it moves through those same 2 gates. The generals call them choke points. The people loading oil onto ships each morning, not knowing which one might not make it to open water, might use a different word.